Hello and welcome to every single legendary lord in the Dwarves ranked from worst to best. If you're not aware, this is all leading up to me ranking every single legendary lord in the entirety of Warhammer 2 from worst to best, so if you want to see that video, then be sure to subscribe. I'll first quickly go over the rules and criteria. I'm going to be focusing on the campaign rather than multiplayer because that's kind of my thing, and also anyone can make anything work in multiplayer if they are good enough. I'm going to be taking into account everything I can that is specific to the Lord and faction. That includes the unique effects they bring to their faction, the effects they have on their army, and of course, the Lord themselves and their performance in battle. Now, with all that being said, let's get into the rankings, starting in 4th place. Is it any surprise to anyone that it is poor Bellagar Einhammer? His starting location at Karak Izor actually isn't too bad, since he is in the mountains and has mountains to travel across all the way to the rest of the Dwarves in the east. Now, unfortunately, this location is actually made totally dogshit by the fact that Bellagar must get in control of Karak 8 peaks or all upkeep will be increased by 50% permanently. It is a lengthy journey that you really need to rush if you want to survive the campaign. And it's a real shame because it takes a start that would otherwise be really good and makes it into something that is more akin to absolute suffering. For his other faction mechanics, he grants 10 leadership when laying siege, starts with 4 ancestral ethereal heroes, he gets a unique building chain at Karak 8 peaks, and his entire faction gets Vanguard deployments during underway battles. As for his own personal army, he grants 10 leadership when fighting against Greenskins and Skaven. As for his starting units, he brings Dwarf Warriors, which are your early game melee infantry, Rangers, which are a mid-tier stealthy archers unit, and Hammerers, which are top-tier armor-piercing melee infantry. As for Bellagar himself, he's a super-duper tanky lord, tons of armor, great melee stats, and decent damage even without a ton of armor piercing. He's also a siege attacker, so can tear down gates without needing a battering ram, though when would you ever use one of those anyway? And with all his items and abilities, he gets a bunch of buffs for himself and allies. Now, the reason for his rank is quite clear. He's the worst lord, and it is only really down to one reason. The increase to his upkeep before capturing Karak 8 peaks makes his early game into a gargantuan pain in the ass. Now granted, once you capture Karak 8 peaks and your upkeep goes back to normal, it's not so bad. Although, if you played it like I did, you will have rushed all the way to Karak 8 peaks and have some very shoddily defended settlements just waiting for the Greenskins to come take them. Dwarves are expensive anyway, so increasing that upkeep by 50% and forcing you to make your way across a large portion of the old world and take a settlement that is pretty heavily fortified and will need one full, if not 2 stacks of units to take it out. It is quite the Herculean task. Now, to be fair to him, aside from that one thing, he's actually pretty good. The other faction effects are pretty powerful, especially the ancestral heroes. They are fantastic. His army effects are basic, but useful for him going against enemies he normally would. He's also a very tanky fighter, if a little basic, but it is the Dwarf, so they're not exactly exciting in the Lord department. Coming in 3rd place, we have Ungrim Ironfist. His faction starts at Karak Kadrin in the North Mountains. There are Greenskins to the north and south, but they are weaker and more isolated tribes, so you're a little safer than those dwarves in the south. You also have easy access to other dwarf factions to reach out for alliances nice and early. For his faction effects, he has the suitable climate of Frozen, minus 75% construction cost for Slayer buildings, minus 50% recruitment cost for Slayers, and plus 10% speed for all infantry. For his own personal army, he grants minus 25% upkeep, plus 5 melee attack, and the passive Journey's End for all Slayer units. And for his starting units, he gains Giant Slayers, which are a speedier, anti-large, and armor-piercing infantry unit with Unbreakable, Thunderers, which are an earlier game armor-piercing ranged gunner unit, and Slayers, which are like Giant Slayers but less armor-piercing. As for Ungrim himself, he's the Slayer King who specializes in taking out, of course, large targets. He has a massive amount of armor, great melee stats, and fantastic armor piercing with that bonus versus large. He's also got Unbreakable, so will stick around until the very end and take a lot of enemies down with him. With all his items and abilities, he's granted a bunch of buffs for himself and allies. Now for the reasoning for his rank. Now, controversial opinion inbound, I think Ungrim might have as good or a better starting location than the Dwarf's capital, and that's all down to the power of the Greenskins right now and as they have been for the past year. The Greenskins have been catapulted into the stratosphere and the Dwarves have been left behind in the dust and can't really compete, and thus starting with all these super powerful Greenskins right on your doorstep is kind of suffering. However, his faction focuses solely on Slayers, and it really lets him down because Slayers are kind of a little bit shitty against anything that isn't large. Unfortunately, there are no other buffs for any units that aren't Slayers, and at most, I would say you should be taking 4 Slayers in your armies, so that's 15 units in every army not getting you any buffs. Even if you decide to take all your infantry as Slayers, that's only 6 to 8, which again leaves 11 units that you aren't even touching. Ungrim himself is a decent fighter, but again, he's a Slayer, so if he's going against anything that isn't large, he's not going to be optimal. Coming in second place, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone, is Fargrim Grudgebearer. His faction starts in Karaz-Akarak, which is of course the capital of all the dwarves, but honestly it's not the best start I've ever seen due to the reasons I just mentioned. It is only, as I mentioned, due to the greenskin rework making them astronomically powerful, and the dwarf update not really doing that. All the greenskins are literally next door to the south, so after about 10 turns they'll start confederating each other and you'll be up against the combined forces of the entirety of the greenskins in the south. Anyway, his other faction mechanics, he gains 20 relations with other dwarves, which is very handy for getting those alliances and non-aggression packs. He gains minus 25% construction cost for military recruitment buildings, minus 15% upkeep for longbeards and hammerers, and plus 3 to recruit rank for hammerers. As for his personal army, he doesn't actually have any effects unless you count his increased leadership aura size by 75% and the leadership aura effect by 8 leadership. For his starting units, he gains hammerers, which are your top tier arm piercing melee infantry, a grudge thrower, which is a basic but very powerful catapult unit, and quarrelers, which are the early game crossbow infantry. As for Fargrim himself, he's a heavy armoured and heavy hitting, though not majorly armour piercing lord. He does also have magical attacks, so can take on physical resistance units quite easily. He's also majorly tanky, or should I say he and his 4 assistants are majorly tanky, so can hold the line with your troops for a good long while. His items and abilities grant him buffs to himself and allies, and debuffs for enemies. Now the reason for his rank, that starting location isn't as fab as I mentioned with Ungrim, and even though it is actually the capital of the dwarves, I still don't think it's definitely the best one. I think there's definitely some room for improvement there. However, it's still a hub from which you can make friends with all the other dwarves to ally and confederate, especially with the increased relations. The other faction mechanics are pretty decent for once you get to the late game, and the military cost reductions will help you get there with less coin. His army doesn't really get any buffs aside from him being nearby, giving them more leadership, so if they aren't nearby to him, they may as well be completely alone. Fargrim himself is a very tanky dude in battle, but as for actual fighting, he's not the best, mostly because he's such a large hitbox and struggles to make his way through crowds. Coming in first place, is it any surprise, it is the white dwarf himself, Grombrindle. His faction starts in the same place as Fargrim, hasn't got his own faction capital yet, and even when you are picking him, it shows that the leader of the faction is Fargrim Grudgebearer, which is kind of a little bit sad, but I digress. For his faction effects, he grants 60% evasion chance when using the underways, 20% to weapon strength when fighting elves, and the power of the ancestor gods, which provides a choice of 4 buffs every 25 turns. Now these buffs can affect the campaign, to affecting himself in battle, to affecting the rest of your units in battle, so there really is one for every occasion. For his army buffs, he grants 50% to reinforcement range and 10 leadership flat for all units, which is pretty incredible. For his starting units, he gains a Gyrocopter Brimstone gun, which is a decent ranged flying unit with a bonus versus large, Iron Drakes, which are an infantry melting flamethrower unit, and Miners with blasting charges, which are a weak early game armor piercing unit with ranged explosives. As for Grombrindle himself, he is an incredible fighter with tons of armor and damage, both armor piercing and magical. His melee stats are phenomenal, and to top it all off, he's unbreakable. He's great versus lots of units or duels. As long as he's in melee, he's doing a great job. If he gets singled out by ranged, well, at least he's a small target. With all his items and abilities, they grant him even more buffs for himself and allies, as well as debuffs to allow him to pin down his enemies. Now the reason for his rank is he has the same starting location as Fargrim, so he's obviously going to be in one of the top 2 positions. His faction effects are honestly pretty pointless for the most part, since he's not really going to be fighting the elves. However, the power of the ancestor gods are pretty great, with each of them being viable choices at different stages of the game, as well as that the evasion chance when using the underways avoids a lot of unnecessary headaches. The army effects are basic, much like most things in the dwarves, but they are still very powerful. And Grom himself, he may be a basic fighter, but he's also the best in a set of 4 basic fighters, because he has the best combination of speed, armor, damage, and the fantastic smoke bomb ability that helps him pin down speedy enemies. There is no question he is the best dwarf for now. And that concludes my ranking of the Dwarf Lords from worst to best. If you disagree with my ranking, by all means, leave your own personal ranking down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video at any point, then be sure to leave it a like. It really does help out a lot. And if you want to see more videos like this on Total War Warhammer 2, Warhammer 3, and hey, I might even cover some non-Total War titles at some point, then be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, in particular Kobe Said So, Nifty Norm, for their fantastic support of the Unclean Ones tier. One more time, thank you so very much for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.